Hey everyone, this is Karthik Viswanathan for WP-Tuts Plus. Today I'm going to be doing a screencast for you on the WP-Transients API, so the WordPress Transients API. Now, what is the WP-Transients API? Well, first off, let's look at the word transient. When something is transient, it means that it's not permanent. It means that it changes with time. So what we're going to be dealing with is data that changes with time, and we're going to use the Transients API to deal with this data effectively. So let's look at the Transients API on the WordPress Codex. You can just simply search up Transients API WordPress on Google and you'll land on this page. Now, the great part about this API is that there are only three functions that we'll really be using: set transient, get transient, and delete transient. And with only three functions to use in this whole API, it just makes it a lot easier to get integrated into your project, a lot easier to understand, and you'll pick it up quite easily. So I'm going to go into each one of these functions while we're actually coding, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. The next thing I want to show you guys is I already have a simple WordPress theme set up. This actually uses the Twitter Bootstrap framework, which you can find on GitHub. It's just a CSS framework. It's actually quite powerful, and it has a lot of goodies baked into it. And so this is just a starter WordPress theme. And I already have the code set up, and we're just going to dive directly into the functions.php file, and we're going to start working with the Transients API. And there are actually three things we're going to be focusing on. The first thing is going to be retrieving a Twitter follower account. Now, a follower account changes with time, and we're going to be using the WP Transients API to cache the follower account, as well as cache all of the data that we're actually retrieving, and retrieve it in an effective manner. So in addition to the follower account, we're also going to be accessing recent tweets. And finally, the classic FeedBurner subscriber count, all with the Transients API. And since these are very, very useful and very common to a blog, they'll hopefully be useful in your own applications. Now, to begin, let's first just create a function. We're going to be calling it WP-Tuts Twitter follower count. And what we're going to be doing in here is essentially retrieving this count and using the Transients API to cache it. So before we do this, let's first take a look at how to actually retrieve this count. Well, why don't I just start directly from Google? If we search up Twitter API and we click on the first link and click Get Started with the API, and then click on the REST API, this will actually lead us to the page that we want to go to. So the REST API is what we're going to be using. We're going to be sending HTTP requests to Twitter, and they're actually GET requests to Twitter, and retrieving some of this data. So to actually get the follower count, what we're interested in is users lookup. It's right over here. So what users lookup lets us do is it lets us get someone's user information. So in this case, I'm going to be getting the user information of the Envato WP account, which is just basically the Twitter account for WP Tuts Plus. Now, in order to do this, it's actually very simple. We just visit this URL right here and pass in the screen name parameter as Envato WP, and that will give us the user information. Now notice that there's also this format variable preceding the dot, and this is just what format we want the data to be returned in. And the formats possible are JSON and XML. In this case, I'm actually going to use JSON because PHP has JSON decode, has a JSON decode function that we'll be using in just a minute. So anyway, if we were to visit this URL right here, and we pass in the screen name of Envato WP, you'll notice that we get all of this data. Now, first off, let me just change this to XML because it's easier to view in the browser. You'll notice that this is just a lot of information about the Envato WP Twitter account. And what we're looking for is right over here. It's this followers count. And we just want to extract this information and use it along with the Transients API. So now that we know how to actually get this data or where this data is found, let's go ahead and start coding. So there are three main steps to dealing with transients. The first thing to do is actually get the transient. So first off, before we do that, let's give a name to our transient. I'm gonna name it. Actually, I'm just gonna name it the exact same thing as the function name. And I'm going to retrieve, and I'm going to get the count now. So get transient. GetTransient is the function inside the Transients API, and we're going to pass in the transient name, and this will effectively just get the count, the Twitter count. Now, Now you must be wondering, well, we haven't actually stored anything. We haven't actually set a transient in the first place. We haven't set a Twitter account. Yes, that's true, and this is actually part of the whole routine. The second thing that we do, which is where you'll see this all coming together, is check whether the count is equal to false. And if the count is equal to false, this means one of two things. The first thing that could be true is there was no transient ever set, or the second thing is that the transient could be expired. So along with each transient that we set, there's an expiry time. And after that expiry time has elapsed, false is returned from getTransient. So if count is equal to false, that essentially means that we need to refresh this transient. We need to get the data from the Twitter API and set it as a transient. So what the whole WP-Transients API is just like a nice caching system, and it makes it really easy to cache this data and therefore retrieve it effectively. So now, one of the things you might notice is inside my if statement, I like to write down false first and then equals to count. Now the reason for this is, let's say that I did it the other way, which is just if count is equal to false. And for some reason, I accidentally left out two of these equal signs, and it just came out to be if count is equal to false. The problem is that this will actually set the variable count to false, and it's sometimes a difficult bug to find out. It's just one missing equal sign, and it can be a big problem. Now, if you were to just change the way you coded this to if false is equal to count, well, now if you were to do something like if false equals count, this will actually throw an error, or it'll actually throw a warning. I'm not sure which one, but effectively, what we're seeing here is that by just switching the direction of the equality, you can save yourself some time and prevent errors. Okay, so now that we've done this, what we need to do is get the Twitter account, get the Twitter follower account from the API. To do this, let's first get the data from that URL I was talking about. To do that, let's just use the file_get_contents PHP function. So we're just getting that user lookup right over here. Now the next thing we need to do is parse through this. So first off, I'm going to get the JSON object, or just the object after parsing out the data. So we're going to use the JSON decode function. Now this is a built-in PHP function. It's just going to decode the JSON from this URL. Now the next thing we want to do is get the data we're looking for. So if we look at this, if we look at this URL, you'll notice a few things. First off, this is all inside an array. All this data is inside an array. You see the two brackets at the beginning and end. The next thing you want to notice is that the first element of the array is actually an object. So what we want to do is we want to retrieve the first index, the 0th index, and that'll be an object. And then we want to find the followers count variable inside that object. And that's what we want to use. That's what we want to retrieve. So how do we do this? Well, first off, now that we have the JSON, let's just do some validation. Let's check that the JSON is valid. If decode fails, the variable JSON will be null or false, so we can just check if JSON. We also want to ensure that JSON sub 0 is set, and that JSON sub 0 sub followers count, or followers count, is also set. Now notice a few things here. First off, remember that JSON sub 0 is an object, and the followers count attribute is inside that object. So that's why this is not another array index. It's just a variable as part of that object. So now that we've asserted that we have the data that we're looking for, let's store it. So the first thing we want to do is store this inside this count variable. So, and I also want to cast this to an integer just to make sure that it's of the right type. So we're storing the count. And the next thing we want to do is set the transient. So now that we've retrieved the data, so first off, we tried to retrieve the data. We realized that the data on this line, we realized that the data has expired or is not even set yet. So now we want to set the data. Well, how do we set the data? The first thing we do is we pass in the transient name to set, which is the same as what I defined above. The next thing is we want to set what the data actually is, so count. So we're setting the transient with the name WP-Tuts Twitter follower count to the count that we just retrieved. The third parameter to this is the expiry time, which is what I was talking about earlier, essentially the time to cache this value. In this case, I want to make it 1 day. And notice that this parameter is in seconds, so I'm doing 60 seconds times 60 seconds per minute times 24, or sorry, 60 seconds is 1 minute, another 60 seconds, another 60 minutes is 1 hour, and 24 hours is 1 day. So essentially 24 times 60 is the number of seconds in 1 day. So now that we've done this, that's really all that's necessary, and we can just return count. So notice what we did here. We first tried to get the transient. If the transient was somehow expired, we did all of this parsing through the API, and we retrieved it, and we actually set the transient. And then we just simply returned the count. We just simply returned the value of that transient, or the newly acquired value. So what this allows us to do is just a very robust caching system. It enables us to easily check whether some value has expired and immediately renew it. And this is all we need in order to display the follower count that we're looking for. So why don't we actually implement this and display the follower count? So inside the header area of the boilerplate I showed you, why don't we just echo out the follower count? So Twitter follower count. And we want to echo out, what was our function called? It was called WP-Tuts Twitter follower count. And let's close off our paragraph tag. And let's visit our website. And there we go. You can see that the Twitter follower count, 2,935. If we go back to the page, you'll notice that this was actually the value right there. Now, one of the things that I want to help you guys notice is that this is actually a cached value. So if we were to do something, just echo out something here, this is not cached. You'll notice that if we enter inside this if statement, it means that the value has expired. It's not cached anymore. We need to reobtain it. We need to go through the API and obtain it again. So if I refresh the page, you'll notice that this line right here, this is not cached. It's not appearing anywhere, and that's because that the value has been cached. It's inside the transient. The transient has not expired, and therefore this is not being displayed. Now, if we were to delete the transient, delete transient, which simply just deletes the transient, as per the name, and then try to get it again, well, it's obviously not going to be set, and we're going to enter this. So if we refresh, you're going to see this is not cached, which is what we just printed out. And if we delete this and try it again, you'll notice that now it has been set, and therefore this is no longer appearing. And so this is just effectively showing you that the data is in fact cached and our function worked. So now that we have the followers count set up, why don't we move on to the second example, which is going to be the recent tweets. So Twitter recent tweets. So let's make up a new transient name right here. And we're going to do the exact same thing as last time. Actually, this should be renamed. This is no longer a count. This is just the tweets. And right here as well. So now what we're going to do is try to we're going to get the recent tweets from Twitter for the Envato WP account, and we're going to store them inside a transient called WP-Tuts Twitter recent tweets. So how do we do this? Well, let's go back to that Twitter API that I was referring to. And this time, what we actually need is, let's see, it was, oh yes, here it is. It's the user timeline. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so what the user timeline lets us do is it lets us retrieve statuses of a user, the latest statuses that a user has posted. And this is essentially what we need to use in order to retrieve the latest tweets of the Envato WP account. So in order to use this, we need to specify user ID, or actually not a user ID, a screen name. Note that each Twitter account actually has a user ID associated with it, and that's another identifier for your Twitter account, but you can also just use your screen name, which is Envato WP in this case, and that's what I'm going to use. And the next thing that we need is the count variable. We're going to specify how many tweets we want to retrieve. The max is actually 20, I believe. Let's see. Oh, never mind. Sorry, the max is 200. 20 is the default. And in addition to specifying the count, we also need to specify trim user. So what trim user lets us do is it just basically lets us get rid of superfluous information. All we really need is the tweets and their text. We don't want the extra information. This will actually give us this will actually trim down all the information to just the tweets, and it won't include any extra information that's not necessary. So those are the three parameters we're going to need to provide to the user timeline. And if we visit this, I actually have this URL already set up. So I'm visiting user timeline. I'm specifying the JSON format. I'm specifying the screen name of Envato WP, a count of 5 tweets. Trim is going to be true. And also I'm going to exclude replies. Now, excluding replies, this is just another way to trim out the data. We just want the tweets. We don't want any of the replies to the tweets. And that's essentially what the exclude replies parameter does. So we have all of our data right here. So I'm going to switch this to XML just to show you once again what it looks like. There are multiple tweets. Each one is inside this status right here. Each one of these status tags contains a tweet, and each one has a text. And text is just what the tweet contains, and that's what we're interested in. So we're going to do this kind of the exact same thing that we did last time, except we're going to parse out this data and figure out how to actually retrieve these tweets. So in order to do this, I'm going to first off just copy this because our code is going to be similar. The first thing we need to do is use this URL right here instead of the one that we had before. The next thing is we're going to decode it. And actually, what we want now is all we have to check is if the JSON is valid. And if the JSON is valid, we're just going to set tweets equal to the JSON. And we're going to store the transient with these tweets. Now the reason I'm directly setting tweets equal to the JSON and not parsing out the data in any way is because this data, as I showed you in the XML version, is effectively just all the tweets. When you're actually displaying these tweets in a page, that's when we're really going to go ahead and parse out all of this. For now, all I'm doing is just storing the JSON object inside the transient, and then retrieving this, and then we can just deal with all of the viewing later. So effectively, I'm trying to spread out the logic for retrieving it and the logic for viewing it. So at this point, I'm just storing the JSON data directly. So what we're going to do is set transient, the transient name that we specified earlier, along with the tweets that we just received, as well as the time. I'm going to keep it as 1 day. Of course, you can change this to your needs as necessary. All right, so let's go ahead and go back into our header, and let's add this in. So how about most recent tweet? So what we want to do here is get the tweets, which is going to be inside which is going to be returned by the WP-Tuts Twitter recent tweets function, and then we're going to print out the first tweet's text. So how do we do this? Well, first off, if you look at the JSON response, you'll notice that once again there's an array, 2 brackets. There's also an object, and there's actually multiple objects, each one representing a tweet. So we only want the first object because we're just printing out the most recent tweet. We're going to get the text parameter. Where is that? The text is right here. So we want to get the text, not the text parameter, the text variable inside the object, and that's what we're going to print out. So this is going to be, we want to echo out tweets sub-0 and text, and text is going to be the text of the tweet, and 0 means the first tweet. And just close out our p tag. And you'll notice if we go back, you'll see most recent tweet, and there's the most recent tweet. Build a short URL service with WordPress custom post types. And if we go back to our data, you'll see that this is, in fact, it is the most recent tweet, and that's what we just printed out. Now, one of the things that would be nice to actually add to this function is just a simple extra variable, count, as a parameter, and we can pass this in to this URL right here. So what I did was I just added this this parameter in count, and now it's present in the URL as the count variable, and this will allow us to determine how many tweets we actually want returned. It'll be a bit more efficient as well, since we don't have to return as many. Since we only have to return as many tweets as we need. So right here, I'm going to pass in only 1, since we're just looking at the most recent tweet, and it still works. So that's great. So finally, we're going to move on to the last function of today, which is going to be getting the classic feed burner follower number of subscribers. So how do we do this? Well, same as before, WP-Tuts feed burner subscriber count. Okay, and why don't I just copy in this and we'll change something around. Now, if you notice, I'm actually copying the same code multiple times, and this really shows us that this could use some form of organization in order to make it dry, basically in order to prevent repetition of the same code. And we'll actually get into that. Before we end this tutorial, we'll actually make this all into one class and condense it so that it doesn't repeat the same code over and over again. So we're going to name this one the same as the method, or the same as the function, excuse me, WP-Tuts feed burner subscriber count. And we're going to be retrieving a count this time. So I'm just going to rename this variable to count. Okay, and let's start trying to retrieve this count. So how do we do this? Well, FeedBurner has a very convenient API. It's just feedburner. Well, here, you can read the URL. It's right over here. You can just search for FeedBurner Awareness API and you'll get this URL. And we're going to pass in WP-Tuts as a parameter, as a URI parameter. And this is just essentially, we're using the WP-Tuts account, which is the account for WP-Tuts Plus. And it gives us some basic data about the blog. And the most significant in this case for us being the circulation. The circulation is the number of subscribers, and that's what we're going to be trying to retrieve. So, just like last time, we're going to first get the data. Okay, so we have the data, and now we need to parse through it. Well, there are a few ways to do this. We could use a PHP XML parser and actually parse out this whole XML file and then try to get the circulation. To me, I just really prefer a simple regular expression. It's very easy to do and it's pretty quick as well. You don't need to worry about parsing the whole file when you only really want one piece of information. Okay, so we're going to add an if statement and we're going to test a regular expression right here. So what we're going to do is create a regular expression. And if you notice, first off, I'm setting my bounding character to this little squiggly line, which is it's going to be at the top left of your keyboard, actually. So this is just the bounding character. Remember, in a regular expression, is just something that bounds it, that denotes when it starts and when it ends, so that you can add modifiers to it after the bounds. But effectively, this can be anything. The most common one that you'll see everywhere is the /. But in this case, this is just something I like to use because I almost never actually see it inside my regular expression. To clarify that, if you use a /, and if for some reason you have a / somewhere in your regular expression, you always need to escape it with a backslash, like so. Like what I have right over here. So I try to use a character that I almost never use in regular expressions, and this is the one that I opt for. So anyway, what we're trying to match is circulation equals, and then some number inside quotes. So how do we do that? Well, first off, we know that the circulation part equals and quotes are going to stay constant. The only thing that varies is what's inside here, and it's going to be a number. So what we can do is use \d. What \d is it's just a digit, and what we want it could be multiple digits. So we want \d plus, which basically means one or more. So one or more digits is what we're matching. And then we also want to capture this. So what I mean by capture is we want to get this value later on because this is what we're looking for. So we put parentheses around it. And these parentheses let us capture it. The next thing I'm going to pass is the actual data. And the last thing is an array of matches. And PHP will populate this array. We'll make this an array and populate it with the matches that we're going to use later on. With this match actually in particular, which we're going to use. So we're gonna preg match, and we're also going to check whether matches sub1 exists. So actually, let me clarify this a little bit. First off, if preg match actually matches this, it will return true. It'll return 1, and actually, to be a little more specific, it'll return the number of matches it made. Since preg match only only matches once and then stops, it'll return 1 or 0 in this case. So if this does match it correctly, it'll effectively return true, and if it doesn't, it'll return false. So if it did match it correctly and the first match is set, remember that the first match is just this text right here. Matches sub 1 is what's located inside the first set of parentheses. Matches sub 0, what that is it's actually this whole text, this whole thing right here. But what we're looking for is just what's inside the first parentheses, which just matches sub 1. So what we're going to do now is, now that we have matches, now that we've asserted that our data is valid, we're going to store this count inside our transient. So we're going to say count is equal to int. We're going to cast it to an integer of matches sub 1. And then what we're going to do is, first off, just really quick, I like to do this just to ensure that I'm working with a data type that I'm working with a valid data type. This is supposed to be an integer. I don't want it to be any other data type. It's just a nice safety measure, and it's an easy way to really just ensure that your variables are valid and of the right type, so that you don't run into obscure issues. And now what I'm going to do is set this as the transient. So set transient, our name that we originally set, the value, which is going to be count, and the time. I'm just going to stick with 24 times 60 times 60, or 1 day, because FeedBurner actually only updates every day, so there's no point in doing anything less than this. Okay, so now that that's been done, that's actually about it. That should get us the subscriber count, and it should set it in a way such that it's cached. So why don't we try this out? Let's go back to our header, and now let's print out the subscriber count. So we want to echo WP-Tuts FeedBurner subscriber count. Let's go back, refresh, and there it is, 3,704 subscribers. That is in fact what it was. So there it is. We now have our Twitter follower count, our most recent tweet, or as many recent tweets as we want, up to 200 that is, and our subscriber count, all ready to go on our WordPress blog via WP-Transients, which is actually directly built into WordPress. So this is really great. It's a very simple way to get all of these counts. Now, to get not only all of these counts, but also any really changeable and cacheable data that you want to get for your blog. Now, before we wrap up this tutorial, I want to improve this code a little bit, because if you notice, what I said before is that this all looks almost exactly the same. We set some transient name, we get the transient, we set the transient, and we return it. Same exact code in about 5 different places with just a few changes. Now this just calls for some dryness. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself, and we need to figure out a way to make this more organized, to figure out a way to make this more clean. And that's what we're going to implement. This time it's going to be via a class. So let's create a class here. Let's call it WP-Tuts Transients. Okay. Sorry. Let me just get this indentation correct. All right. And now what we're going to do here is create some helper functions for us in order to accomplish this better. So let's create a helper function inside here. Let's make this private, and we'll call it private function process transient. So this function process transient, it's going to take a transient name, and it's going to take a process function, so as parameters. So what it's going to do is it's effectively going to do this repetitive tasks that we keep seeing, repetitive common tasks that we keep seeing between the transients. So effectively get the transient, check if it's false, do some processing, which is variable depending on what transient we're dealing with, and then return it. This is a very common structure to all of the transients that we're dealing with. So that's what we're going to factor out into this function. So how do we do that? First off, we have our transient name, and we have the process function, which basically contains whatever's inside here. So what we need to do is first get the transient. So transient is equal to get transient. Or actually, sorry, we've already used the transient variable. So let's just change this to data is equal to get transient. Remember, transient is the name. That's the name that we're passing in to get transient. The next thing we want to do is check if data if false is equal to data. Remember that as a quick tip that I mentioned earlier, you want to use false in front. Actually, I don't quite remember if I did mention this, but let me just go over just very briefly again. The great part about using false before a variable, so saying false is equal to data instead of data is equal to false, is it prevents invalid assignment. So essentially, if you do something like if data is equal to false and you accidentally forget some equal sign here, then this is actually an assignment and it will set the value of data to false. And that can actually cause various issues in your code. If, however, you have false in front, this will return an error. And that's why it's just easier for us. It takes no more effort, and yet it prevents errors. So that's why having false in front is a great little helper. Okay, so now what we're going to do is call the process function. So we're going to check if is callable. So we're checking if process is a valid callable function. Then we're going to call it. So call user func process. And actually, what we want to do is set transient, call user func process, and a time that we're going to pass in as a parameter. So actually, let me just clarify this a little bit. So what we're doing is this process function, what it does is it gets new data. It essentially just refreshes the data. I should actually rename it to refresh because that's a better, more descriptive name for it. It refreshes the data. So what we're doing is when we call this function refresh, it's going to return us a new value that we should set as a transient. So if it is callable, if this refresh function is callable, which means we're just checking the validity of our data, we're going to set our new transient. We're going to set it. We're going to set the transient name given to us. We're going to set it with the value returned by our refresh function, and we're going to set the expire time to the time passed into the function. And the last thing we're going to do is simply return the data. Now, there's one more thing we have to do, is actually factor out this call and set data equal to it. And the reason is, since we're returning data in the end, we need to ensure that we set the return value of this refresh function to the variable data, since we're returning it ultimately. So we've essentially just replicated this whole structure. We get the transient, we check if the transient is false, as in if the transient has expired. We call some refresh function, which we're going to implement, which is actually implemented in all of these, but we're going to it's this section right here in between this if statement. We're going to call some refresh function, and then we're going to set the new transient. We're going to revalidate the transient. We're going to make it valid again by setting it, or just setting it if it hasn't even been set yet. And then we're going to return the transient's value. So now we can actually employ this in each one of our subfunctions, or in each one of the functions that we previously created. So first off, let's just make these all public, explicitly defined. And now what we're going to do is employ this. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to change all three of these functions to just have the process code. And what I mean by the process code is just the code that goes inside, just the code that was inside this if statement. Essentially, just the refresh code, the code that refreshes the count. So what I did here was just remove everything except for the refresh code, and I also set the count to false at the beginning. And the reason is just in case the count never gets set, because this never comes in, then we're just going to return false, and that's what the transient is going to get set to, essentially because we couldn't retrieve the data. So all I'm doing here is setting up the refresh code. I'm actually going to rename this to WP-Tuts Twitter follower, or WP-Tuts refresh Twitter follower count. Yes, it's kind of long, but it is descriptive, and it tells us what we're actually doing. So WP-Tuts refresh Twitter follower count, WP-Tuts refresh Twitter recent tweets. Delete all of that. The if statement, the common structure I was referring to, And set tweets is equal to false at the beginning, just like we set count is equal to false here, just in case it never actually enters this loop, this if statement. And then we return tweets. And remember, we also need to get rid of the set transient call, because that's done inside our helper function right here. And the exact same thing here, WP-Tuts refresh feed burner subscriber count. Okay, and get rid of set transient. Set count is equal to false originally, and there we go. So now that we have this done, these are essentially just three functions that refresh the data that we got earlier. It queries all three functions, query the API and get the data from the API, and essentially just refresh whatever count there was. And this refresh count is used inside set transient. Is used in a call to set transient, just like we were doing before, but now factored out into a separate function. Now we need to actually write the functions that employ process transient. So how do we do that? Well, let's make a new function, WP Twitter follower count, and what this will do is return process transient. The transient name is WP Twitter follower count. The refresh function is WP Tuts refresh Twitter follower count. But what we actually have to do is pass in a reference to the function inside this class. So essentially, what we want to be called is the WP Tuts refresh follower count inside this class. And in order to make it callable, we have to create an array like this. And the reason we do this is actually how call user func works. If we pass an array with the object and the corresponding method to call user func, it'll actually call this method of this object. So this refers to our object right here, our WP Tuts plus transient. WP Tuts transients object, and WP refresh Twitter follower count is what we just wrote right over here. So we process the transient, and we're just going to return the value returned from that, which is the transient, the value of the transient, and that's all we needed to do. Actually, one more thing, sorry. We also need to pass in a time. Let's just stick with 24 times 60 times 60, or 1 day. So now we need two more of these. WP Tuts, this is going to be Twitter recent tweets. And instead, we're going to be naming this WP Tuts Twitter recent tweets, and we want to call the correct function, the correct method. So just a few changes, and the same thing, we're just returning process transient. And we want to repeat this exact same process for the last one, which is the feed burner subscriber count. Okay, so actually, if you notice here, one of the great parts about this is that now we no longer have this repeating get transient, check if false, and then return code everywhere. It's all been factored out. It has all been factored out, and they're all in separate functions that only do the tasks that they're required to do without repeating unnecessary code. So we just made our whole code a lot more drier, without repetition, essentially. So I'm actually going to move the private function to the bottom to make it clear that the ones that need to be called, though the public functions, are up top. And then I'm going to define a constructor here. No parameters. It actually doesn't need to do anything, but I'll just define it so it's clear that this object does need to be constructed. Note that each of these functions, they aren't static. They're part of the object, so you need an instance of the object in order to use them. So now what we're going to do is let's create a new WP Tuts Transients object. Okay, and this is what we're going to be using everywhere in order to get the Twitter follower count, in order to get the recent tweets and the feed burner subscriber count. So inside our header, that's exactly what we need to do. One of the things that I want to mention is that you need to declare this as global because it's defined inside the functions.php file, and it's actually considered a global function because this file header.php is included in a separate in a sub function. So essentially, WP-Transients, this variable, is inside the parent scope of the header.php include. So we need to use the global keyword here in order to get access to this because it's inside a parent scope. And now what we need to do is we want to call the WP-Tuts Twitter follower count method just like before, except now it's part of the WP-Tuts Transients class, the WP-Tuts Transients object. Okay, and let's try that out. Okay, so we have a slight error here. Line 288, expecting unexpected string. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Public function WP-Transients. Okay, we also have something else. Process transient is undefined. Ah, yes. The reason for this is we need to ensure that we call it with this variable. Otherwise, it doesn't know what it is. It has to be in the right context. So since this is a method inside the WP-Tuts Transients class, we need to call this process transients and not just process transients. Okay, and if you notice the same exact thing as before, we have our follower count, we have our most recent tweet, and we have our subscriber count, except this time we factor them all out into separate functions, and these functions employ the drive principle, the don't repeat yourself principle, and it's all working out. So it looks like, as a quick summary to the tutorial, we just went over the WP-Transients API. You can search it up, just search Transients on Google, and you'll find the API right here. It has the three main functions that we use: set transient, get transient, and delete transient. We ended up creating a class that allowed us to retrieve three different things: the Twitter follower count, the recent tweets of the Twitter recent tweets, and the feed burner subscriber count. And all of that was done in a very dry method via a class. And with that, I think that's just about it for the tutorial. Hope you liked it, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.